Thank you, Mr. President. I rise today to join my colleagues in expressing my opposition to the President's nominee for the Director of the Office of Management and Budget, Mr. Russell Vought, and to join the millions of Americans who have been gravely alarmed by the President's order to cut off already appropriated federal funds for communities all across the country, a move which has been a long-standing priority for Mr. Vought. I can think of few people more dangerous and deeply unsuited for the role of Director of the Office of Management and Budget, or OMB, than Mr. Vought. It's not simply that Mr. Vought's proposals will devastate communities across our country, though if enacted, they certainly will. It's not simply that Mr. Vought's values are deeply out of step with the majority of Americans, though they are. And it is not simply that Mr. Vought has demonstrated a complete lack of regard for the notion of government by consent of the governed, though time and again he has done just that. It's because in the President's order to cut off funding for all federal grants, a passion project straight from the pages of Mr. Vought, the President's reckless and illegal actions have already thrown communities into chaos, and they have hurt the American people. Any nomination for a senior post in an administration is, to a degree, an act of faith. We never fully know the manner in which someone will perform their duties until they are in the post. But with Mr. Vought, the situation's different. Not only do we have a clear picture of how Mr. Vought would approach the job from his last time that he held this post, not only do we have a blueprint from the proposed budget developed by Mr. Vought at his think tank, we need only to look at the events of the last week to see how Mr. Vought would handle his office. Mr. Vought was the architect of President Trump's order to cut off federal grants to communities in every corner of the country, including in New Hampshire. This order rightly and deeply alarmed constituents across our land who have appropriately inundated their senators' and governors' offices with calls expressing their opposition to the President's reckless, thoughtless, and uninformed action. The President, through his order, interrupted cash flow to critical services and left police departments unsure if they were being defunded. He left fire departments wondering if they would get the grants that they depend on to modernize their equipment and hire more firefighters. He left rural hospitals in turmoil as they tried to plan for the months ahead. He left the staffs of homeless shelters who provide care for veterans uncertain if they would have the resources that they need to be a port in the storm for America's heroes. And he left addiction treatment centers without any indication of when the next grant might come, grants that are used to keep our kids and communities safe from the deadly dangers of fentanyl. It was chaos, and it remains chaos. While court orders have brought a temporary pause to the President's funding cutoff, there is no certainty about what will happen next. And in some cases, cash flow is still irregular, leaving everyone from daycare providers to landlords wondering whether or not they will be able to continue to operate. And so the American people wait in the dock, prisoners to the President and Mr. Vought's political games. Mr. Vought has had experience managing the Office of Management and Budget. One would think that he would appreciate that any organization with a budget, a police department, a small business, a hospital, needs to have a reliable idea of what funds are going to be available if they're going to make any plans for the future. They cannot depend on the whims of a president's tweet or on the last-minute salvation of a court order. If a small business is going to add a second location or hire more staff, it can't do it if it has to worry about critical grant money being impounded. If a fire department wants to modernize its operation, it needs to know if the grant that it is planning to apply for and is supposed to be available in a few months a grant that's already been approved and signed into law will exist. If it isn't, the department's new engine is no longer a reality. But perhaps Mr. Vought does not understand how to maintain a budget because, of course, during his time as director of the OMB, he helped blow up the budget deficit and never turned in a surplus, an extravagance that most Americans cannot afford. And make no mistake, this is not an academic discussion. Behind every one of these budget lines are people, people who will be hurt if the President and Mr. Vought get their way and cut off federal grants, grants that are indispensable to Americans for a wide range of critical activities and indispensable to our way of life. They are critical to the firefighter who relies on these grants to have the best equipment while keeping our homes safe from smoke and flame, to the police officer walking the beat who deserves to be supported and not defunded, to the teenager struggling with addiction who is finally on the road to recovery but may fall back into despair if the addiction treatment center closes because the President and Mr. Vought decided that political games are more important than serving the people and saving lives. In short, this chaos, this flurry of orders and memos and counter-orders and Washington doublespeak, this playing with the lives of the American people, this is not leadership, and it is no way to govern a country, much less the greatest country on earth. We've seen Mr. Vought in action. It's already been a chaotic 2 weeks since the President ordered this self-inflicted catastrophe. We cannot afford our police departments, our fire departments, our veterans, our children. We can't afford a chaotic and lawless 4 years under Mr. Vought. Now, what is particularly astonishing about the President and Mr. Vought's reckless order to cut off federal funding is that it betrays how deeply out of touch they are with the American people, how woefully they have misread our country in this moment. Our country, of course, has partisan divisions, but I have found that often, on a more fundamental level, the majority of Americans, not the loud, but the many, want most of the same things. They want costs to come down. They want their rent and groceries to be more affordable. They want to get the care that they need from their doctors without worrying about going into debt. If they have children, they want what all parents want for their kids. They want their kids to be given the chance to follow their dreams. They want to know that they will get to and from school safely each and every day. They want their streets free from the dangers of fentanyl and other drugs. And from their leaders, the American people want leadership and results, and they know a good idea can be red or blue. Lower costs, safer streets, and a more hopeful future. That's what most people want. If the President and Mr. Vought thought it was worthwhile to listen to the American people, then they'd know this. Because in our great country, there is no great clamor from people asking for a president to seize authority that belongs to Congress, to cut off funds to fire departments, police departments, hospitals, and addiction centers. The American people want more money in their pockets. They aren't asking the President to seize power to choke off funds to their communities. The American people didn't ask for this. The American people don't want this. The American people do not deserve this. The President's reckless and extreme order makes one wonder who the President and Mr. Vought believe they're working for. Perhaps Mr. Vought can show me, tell us all, where this great majority of Americans who want a president to have unilateral power to take away fire department grants, defund police departments, or end special education programs, where that majority is. How is America better off with a fire department unable to buy a new engine? How are we better off with more Americans struggling with addiction, unable to get on the road to recovery? Who does it serve when a veteran is forced to sleep on a snowy street because the shelter he used to stay in closed after a funding freeze? And why should the architect of such a plan ever be in a position of authority? But let's say for a moment that the President and Mr. Vought don't get their way, and this funding cutoff is permanently blocked. The fact that one of the administration's first acts was to draft this order shows just how deeply out of step they are with most Americans. This order should never have been given and tells us everything about the President and Mr. Vought's priorities. How does the President's order to do anything to lower, how does the President's order do anything to actually lower prices, to make rent cheaper? What family is better off because of the President's attempted power grab? Who has been made more prosperous, more safe, or more healthy by this action? The President and Mr. Vought's order serves no cause but the advance of the President's personal political power. Now, I continue to stand ready to get to work with anyone, including the President, to work on a bipartisan basis to deliver on the priorities of the American people and bring down costs. But the President and Mr. Vought's actions to put aside efforts to bring relief to American families and instead seize power to cut off funds to every community in the country demonstrates that they are, at the present time, unconcerned with what the American people actually want. Mr. Vought's lack of regard or respect for what the American people want is, unfortunately, not a surprise. Throughout his time in public service, and even in these confirmation proceedings, Mr. Vought has demonstrated a thinly veiled disdain for the principles of self-government, principles which have served America well since we declared our independence. To my Republican colleagues who are hopeful that the President will restore some or all of the funds that were cut off by this order, I would remind you that the grant money was never the President's to cut, freeze, or restore. It doesn't belong to him or to Mr. Vought. It belongs to the American people. Congress makes laws and appropriates funds, not the President. At stake is not a legal technicality. At stake is our very notion of self-government, a notion that Mr. Vought appears to disdain. The right of Congress, the first of the three branches of government provided for in the Constitution, to make laws and appropriate funds was made clear first in our Constitution and then in the Impoundment Control Act of 1974. Administrations from both parties understood and respected this law, but Mr. Vought does not. Mr. Vought has said that he disagrees with this law. In his hearings, he refused to commit to follow the law and has since become the architect of a brazen attack on this very law, the attack launched by the President's order to cut off all federal grants. The laws of the United States are not meant to be enjoyed a la carte. It's not Mr. Vought or the President's prerogative to choose which laws to follow any more than it's their prerogative to choose which federal grants to cut off after the grants have already been appropriated by law. But this is simply who Mr. Vought is. Not a trusted guardian of taxpayers' funds, but a man who believes that both he and the President do not answer to the people. In the past, Mr. Vought has refused to allow for proper oversight. He's refused to cooperate with inspectors general, the people's watchdogs against corruption. He repeated the lie that the 2020 presidential election was rigged and supported the President's attempt to overturn the will of the people, a will that was reflected in our free and fair elections. At the start of the confirmation process, Mr. Vought suggested that the President does not even need the advice and consent of this body, and that instead he could just abuse the power of recess appointments to fill out his cabinet. So Mr. Vought has placed us in a remarkable position. He's asking us to vote for him in a confirmation process that he does not even believe needs to exist. He's asking for the support of the people's representatives while maintaining that he shouldn't even have to answer to the people in the first place. It's also ironic that we are considering Mr. Vought's nomination because it was 5 years ago this week that this body debated President Trump's attempt to illegally impound funds that were intended for Ukraine, an impoundment attempt that was supported and directed by Mr. Vought. 5 years ago, Mr. Vought helped the president cut off legally appropriated funds to America's allies. 5 years later, Mr. Vought has helped the president cut off legally appropriated funds to the American people. 5 years later, it's clear the failure to hold the president and Mr. Vought to account didn't mark the last time that some people in this body surrendered their principles to appease Donald Trump. It was not the end of the indignities that this body would be asked to tolerate. It was barely the beginning. It only encouraged more. That is, of course, the danger of lawlessness. That is the danger of the winding road towards authoritarianism. Once one act of lawlessness is tolerated, it becomes easier to tolerate another, until we arrive to where we are today, where pointing out illegality from our public officials sometimes seems like little more than an afterthought. It should not be too much to ask. It should not be too much to expect that those who have the privilege to help lead the world's greatest democracy follow the laws of our land and respect the consent of the governed. We know what Mr. Vought has done during the president's term. We know that he was the architect of the president's order to seize the power to cut off federal funds. And we know that if given the chance, the budget that he would help author would be the most extreme put forward by any administration in our lifetimes and would be devastating for our country. Through his think tank, Mr. Vought laid out his priorities in what was a proposed budget in 2023 for a potential Trump administration. And now, the president has nominated him to manage the Office of Management and Budget. In his budget, Mr. Vought would gut Medicaid by over $2 trillion. He would undo much of the progress states like New Hampshire have made since we expanded Medicaid. He would kick families off of Medicaid, families who are already feeling the pain of high costs and struggling to make ends meet. More people would become sick because they couldn't afford preventive care and be forced to make impossible choices once they fall ill. These cuts would be especially devastating for families who have children with disabilities, families who rely on Medicaid dollars to get the best support for their children so that the children can thrive and have all the opportunities that any parent wants for their kids, and so the parents can go to work and build a family and a future. It's not clear precisely when, for Mr. Vought, a child with a disability getting the support that they need became less important than paying for a tax break for a billionaire. But it's not just Medicaid. Mr. Vought's budget would end tax credits through the Affordable Care Act that have helped millions of Americans afford life-saving care. His budget would cut back Pell Grants and make it harder for families to afford higher education. His budget would defund much of the FBI, including ending many of the FBI's invaluable counterterrorism efforts. Mr. Vought's budget would also eviscerate the Department of Homeland Security's cybersecurity defenses. He's perhaps one of the first people from either party who in today's age thinks we should be spending less on cybersecurity and not more. Make no mistake, American families would be hurt by Mr. Vought's budget. America would be less safe with Mr. Vought's budget. but few provisions in his budget, his proposed budget, are as outrageous as his cuts to veterans' benefits. Mr. Vought has proposed slashing benefits for veterans by tens of billions of dollars. He's proposed narrowing the number of veterans who are even eligible for certain health benefits. He even proposed banning funding for women's reproductive care for women veterans. These heroes have defended our freedoms abroad, but Mr. Vought would endeavor to deny their freedoms here at home. We will never fully repay the debt that we owe to those who've served. Indeed, we cannot. But we need to try each and every day. We should be working day in and day out to do more for those who serve. But instead, Mr. Vought is looking for ways to slash care and benefits for veterans and their families. Not clear to me what more veterans would need to do, what further sacrifices they would need to make for Mr. Vought to agree to not take away the benefits and care that they have earned through their courage and valor. Let me be clear. There are few things in my mind more deeply un-American than to try to fund the extreme political agenda of a budget by taking money out of the pockets of America's best and bravest. There's been a quality of make-believe surrounding the debate over Mr. Vought's confirmation. Some of Mr. Vought's defenders have dismissed concerns regarding his proposed budget as alarmists. They assure us that this budget will never be passed. They dismiss our concerns regarding his past statements supporting an expansion of authoritarian power as hyperbolic. They insist that his words do not indicate how he will actually act in his role. They dismiss our arguments regarding his record while at the helm of OMB as rehashing ancient history. And some of my colleagues even dismiss our concerns about the President and Mr. Vought's order to cut off federal funds as sensationalist and traumatic. They assure us that the court stopped the order and that the President will hopefully restore these funds soon enough. And maybe on that last point, they're right. Maybe the courts will fully stop the President's order to cut off these funds. Maybe the President and Mr. Vought will be thwarted by the laws that they seek to circumvent. But I submit that the President and his nominees should be judged by what they want to do, not simply by what they are able to get away with. So what kind of America does Mr. Vought want? What would he do if everything that he has proposed in his first term, in his writings, in his hearings, in his budget, and in the President's order to cut off all funds were able to come to pass? Russell Vought's America is an America where Medicaid has ended as we know it, where more people get sick and fewer people get care, where police departments and fire departments are defunded in the service of political games, where our efforts to fight addiction and get fentanyl off our streets are gutted, and where more people slip from the road of recovery into spirals of despair. It's an America where the FBI's counterterrorism program is scrapped and our country is less safe, where cyber criminals from China and Russia are given free rein to gain a leg up. It's an America where families with children with autism are left to fend for themselves, where we even break faith with veterans and take away care that they earned through unimaginable sacrifice. It's an America where even our heroes become dispensable. It's an America where presidents decide which laws to obey and disobey, which funds appropriated by Congress to permit and which to take away, where the people's watchdogs can be fired and the people's representatives ignored. We'd be an America governed not of, by, and for the people, but of, by, and for a president. I don't know with certainty what the future holds, what the courts will permit and what they will block. But I know that in this moment, the question before us is whether or not we should confirm to high office a man who has clear disdain for self-government. Self-government, government of, by, and for the people. It's not simply a patriotic turn of phrase. It's what makes America different. Being a part of this self-government experiment is why all of us are even here, serving in this body in the first place. My dad, a World War II veteran, would always remind me that freedom and democracy are history's exception. They're not the rule. In Iran or in Putin's Russia, there's no debate over impoundment. In autocracies, what the autocrat decrees is law. But in America, we set out to do something different. We created a system of checks and balances. We declared that power was derived from the consent of the governed. Unlike virtually every nation before us, we did not put our trust in kings or oligarchs. Nope. Instead, in the words of Lincoln, we dared to ask, why should there not be a patient confidence in the ultimate justice of the people? Is there any better or equal hope in the world? We believed these words once, and most Americans believe these words still. And we believe that even our greatest leaders need to be checked by the people and their elected representatives. To my Republican colleagues who support the president and who are considering supporting Mr. Vought, and who dismiss his words and actions about the need to seize greater executive power, I'd remind you that history has shown us that when a leader gains a power, they're inclined to use it, and they certainly are not inclined to give it back. The power of the purse is a power that belongs to Congress and the people. My colleagues need to decide if they're willing to surrender that power on their watch. To my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, even if you imagine that you may agree with the ways in which the president would use his power to ignore Congress and impound federal funds today, you certainly may disagree with the ways this illegal power is abused tomorrow. You may open the door for further abuses down the road. You may find that a future president of a different party or persuasion is inclined to use this power in ways that leave you deeply alarmed but unable to stop. That is the danger of surrendering the rule of law to expand executive power. History has shown that the end result is never more freedom because, to borrow a phrase, those who would seek power by riding the back of the tiger surely end up consumed by it. I suspect that my Republican colleagues will vote to confirm Mr. Vought, though they shouldn't. I've voted for many of the president's nominees, and I believe that the president and our country would be better served by people who encourage his better impulses rather than enable his worse ones, and who understand that no leader is above the law, who respect our system of government of, by, and for the people. For in the end, to confirm Mr. Vought is to confirm him in spite of his record, his words, and his promises. So no, I'm not alarmed by Mr. Vought because he's not a member of my party. I'm alarmed by Mr. Vought because, unlike some of my Republican colleagues, I respect Mr. Vought's intelligence enough to take his words seriously. So when Mr. Vought shows his disdain for self-government, I'll take him at his word, and so should this body. In the end, Mr. Vought, while seeking office in our government, is wrong about a fairly fundamental thing. He is wrong about democracy in America. The people's representatives are not a nuisance to be circumvented. The people's laws are not an obstacle to be surmounted, and the people's funds are not a political weapon to be seized. Nor are the people's wills, wants, and yes, votes idle noise to be discarded or ignored. No, in this country, in this great democracy of ours, the will of the people represents nothing less than a hope without better or equal in this world. Mr. President, I can keep speaking about the damage that Russell Vought would do as leader of the Office of Management and Budget. I will also appeal to my colleagues here to let me know if any more of them intend to speak. Mr. Vought's nomination to lead the Office of Management and Budget is one we should all reject, not because we disagree with his policies, but because he fundamentally disagrees with our form of government. He fundamentally disrespects this body, the body created along with the House of Representatives by Article 1 of the United States Constitution. He fundamentally believes that his judgment is better than the people's. And I would also add that Mr. Vought's beliefs are some of the most extreme that I have heard expressed or watched implemented in my lifetime. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor. Mr. President.